The shape of his body showed in the frozen mud, where he had lain face down under the fallen tree. His footprints were sharp in the melting snow, and his feet had left dark, wet blotches where he had climbed the rock. He had lain there for a long time. Long enough it was for time to have lost its meaning. The moon was coming up over the nearer mountain, full and white, edged across with the pattern of naked branches. Its light fell on his upturned face, on his sunken, brilliant eyes, and the puffy blue of jowls on which the beard had started to grow, then stopped. It shone down on the world of trees and rocks of which he was a part, and gave it life. The night was warm. In the valley the snow had long been gone. Flowers were pushing up through the moist earth. Frogs were panpiping in every low spot. Great trout stirred in the deep pools of the river. It was May, but on the mountain, under the north-facing ledges where the sun never came, the snow was still banked deep with an edge of blue ice, and needles of frost glistened in the black mud of the forest floor. It was May. All through the warm night, squadrons of birds were passing across the face of the moon. All night long their voices drifted down out of the dark, like gossip from another world. But to a listener in the night, another voice was clearer, louder, more insistent. Now like the striking of crystal cymbals, now like an elfin chuckling, always a breathless, never-ending whisper. The voice of running water. He heard none of these things. He stood where he had first come into the full moonlight, his face turned up to receive it, drinking in its brightness. It tingled in him like a draught from the things he had forgotten, in another world. It dissolved the dull ache of cold that was in his body and mind, that stiffened his swollen limbs and lay like an icy nugget behind his eyes. It soaked into him and into the world about him, so far that every corner shone with its own pale light, white and vaporous, as far as he could see. It was a strange world. What the other world had been like before he did not remember, but this was different. The moonlight flooded it with a pearly mist through which the columns of the trees rose like shadowy stalagmites. The light mist was not from the moon alone. It was a part of this new world and of the things that were in it. The grey lichens under his feet were outlined with widening ripples of light. Light pulsed through the rough bark of the tree trunks and burned like tiny corpse candles at the tip of every glowing twig. The spruces and the balsams were furred with silvery needles of light. A swirling mist of light hung ankle-deep over the forest floor, broken by black islands of rock. Light was in everything in this new world he was in, save only for the rock and for himself. He drank in the moonlight through every pore, and it burned gloriously in him and flowed down through every vein and bone of his body, driving out the dank cold that was in his flesh. But the light that soaked into him did not shine out again as it did from the budding trees, and the moss, and the lichens. He looked down at his swollen hands and flexed their puffed blue fingers. He moved his toes in their sodden boots, and felt the clammy touch of the wet rags that clung to his body. Under them, out of the moonlight, he was still cold with that pervading chill that was like the frozen breath of winter in him. He squatted in the pool of light that lay over the ledge and stripped them from him, clumsily and painfully, then lay back on the stone and stared up into the smiling visage of the moon. Time passed, but whether it was minutes or hours, or whether there were still such things as minutes and hours, he could not have said. Time had no meaning for him in this new, strange world. Time passed because the moon was higher and its light stronger and warmer on his naked flesh, but he did not sense its passage. Every part of the forest pulsed with its own inner light in response. As the feeling of warmth grew in him, it brought another feeling, a dull hunger gnawing at his vitals, making him restless. He moved close to the great beech, whose limbs reached high above the tops of the other trees around it, and felt the quick chill as its shadow fell across him. Then he had clasped it in both arms, his whole body pressing eagerly against its glowing trunk, and the light that welled out of it was thrilling through him like a flame, stirring every atom of him. He tweaked a long, pointed bud from a twig. It lay in his palm like a jewel of pale fire, before he raised it to his mouth and felt its warmth spread into him. He ate buds as long as he could find them, stripping them from the twigs with clumsy fingers, grubbing hungrily in the moss for the ones that fell. He crushed them between his teeth and swallowed them, and the fire that glowed in them spread into his chilled flesh and warmed it a little. He tore patches of lichen from the rock, but they were tough and woody and he could not swallow them. He broke off spruce twigs, needled and with the life-light, but the resin in them burned his lips and tongue and choked him. He sat, hunched against a rock, staring blindly into the growing depths of the forest. The things he had swallowed had helped a little to alleviate the cold that was in his bones, but they did not dull the gnawing hunger or the thirst that was torturing him. They had life, and the warmth that was life, but not the thing he needed, the thing he must somehow have. At the edge of his field of vision something moved. It drifted noiselessly through the burning tree-tops like a puff of luminous cloud. It settled on a branch above his head, and he twisted his neck back and stared up at it with hollow, burning eyes. The white light mist was very bright about it. He could feel its warmth, even at this distance. And there was something more. The hunger gripped him, fiercer than ever, and thirst shriveled his gullet. The owl had seen him and decided that he was another rotting stump. It sat hunched against the trunk of the great spruce, looking and listening for its prey. Presently it was rewarded by some small sound or a wafted scent, and spread its silent wings to float like a phantom into the night. It did not see the misshapen thing it had thought a stump struggle to its feet and follow. A porcupine, high in a birch, saw the owl pass and ignored it as it well could. A roosting crow woke suddenly and froze on its perch, petrified with terror. But the great bird swept past, intent on other prey. There were clearings in the forest, even this high, where trees had been cut and brambles had followed. All manner of small creatures followed the brambles, and here was rich hunting for the owl and its kind. He came to the edge of the clearing in time to see the owl strike and hear the scream of the hurt rabbit. To his eyes it was though a bolt of shining fire had plunged through the night to strike a second ball of fire on the ground. Shambling forward, careless of the briars, he hurled himself on the two animals before the owl could free itself or take to the air again. The huge bird slashed at him savagely with beak and talons, laying open the puffy flesh of his face in great, curving gashes. But he bit deep into its breast, through feathers and skin, tearing at its flesh with his teeth, and letting the hot, burning blood gush into his parched throat and spill over his cracked lips. His fingers kneaded and tore at its body, breaking it into bits that he could stuff into his mouth. Feathers and bone he spat out, and the rabbit's fur when the owl was gone. But the hollow in his belly was filled, and the thirst gone, and the aching cold in his numbed bones had been washed away. It seemed to him that his fingers were shining a little with the same wan light that emanated from the other things of the forest. He hunted all that night, through the clearing and the nearby forest, and found and ate 2 wood mice and a handful of grubs and other insects. he found that the tightly coiled fiddleheads of growing ferns were full of life, and more palatable than buds or lichens. As the deadening cold left him, he could move more freely, think more keenly, but the thirst was growing on him again. Out of the memories of that world he had left, the murmur of running water came to him. Water should quench thirst. He could hear it below him on the mountainside, through the mist, splashing over bare stones, gurgling through tunnels in the roots and moss. He heard it in the distance, far below in the valley, roaring against the boulders and leaping over ledges in foaming abandon. As he listened, a chill crept over him, as though a shadow were passing. But the feeling left him. Slowly and painfully, he began to pick his way down the mountainside. The water burst out at the base of a rock wall, lay for a little in a deep, clear pool under the cliff, and then slipped away through the moss, twisting and turning, sliding over flat stones and diving into crevices, welling up in tiny, sparkling fountains and vanishing again under tangles of matted roots and fallen tree trunks, growing and running ever faster until it leaped over the last cliff and fell in a spatter of flashing drops into the valley. He saw it and stopped. Black vapour lay close over it like a carpet. It made a pathway of black, winding through the luminous mist that hung over the forest floor. Where the rill lay quiet in a pool, it was thin, and the moonlight struck through and sparkled on the clear water. But where the little stream hurried over roots and stones, the black fog lay dense and impenetrable, dull and lifeless. He licked his lips uneasily with his swollen tongue and moved cautiously forward. The chill had come on him again, numbing his nerves, dulling his labouring brain. Water quenched thirst. He still remembered that somehow, and this singing, shining stuff was water. At the base of the cliff, where the water welled up under the rock, the black fog was thinnest. He knelt and dipped his cupped hands into the water. As the black mist closed over them, all feeling went out of his hands. Cold, terrible numbing cold, ate its way like acid into his flesh and bones. The mist was draining the warmth, the life out of him, through his hands and arms, sucking him dry of the life stuff he had drunk with the owl's blood and soaked in from the moon's white rays. He swayed to his feet, then collapsed in a heap beside the stream. He lay there helpless for a long time. Little by little the moonlight revived him. Little by little the numbness went out of his muscles, and he could move his legs and grip things with his fingers. He pulled his legs under him and got to his feet, leaning against the cliff for support. He stared with burning eyes at the water, and felt the thirst clutching at his gullet and the hunger gnawing in his vitals. Water was death to him. The black fog that lay close over running water was deadly, draining the life force out of whatever touched it. It was death. But blood, fresh, burning, glowing blood, was life. Something rattled in the shadow of the cliff. His eyes found it, a lolloping bundle of fiery spines humping along a worn path that led over the rocks to the little pool. A porcupine come to drink. He sensed the life in it. The hunger twisted his belly, but the black barrier of running water was between him and it. It shambled down to the pool's edge and drank, the glow of its bristling body shining through the black fog over the water. It crossed the little rill where it was narrowest, below the pool, and came rattling up the path towards him, unafraid. He killed it. His face and body were studded with quills before it was dead, but he tore open its body with his two numb hands and let its hot blood swill down his throat and give him back the warmth and life that the black mist had drained out of him. Blood was all he needed, He had learned that, and he left the porcupine's limp carcass by the path and turned back into the forest. Water was everywhere, here on the lower slopes of the mountain. Its black runways ribbed the glowing floor of the forest on every side. It made a wall of cold about the place where he was, so that he had to climb back to the summit of the ridge and go around its sources. The sun rose, bringing scathing golden light that shriveled his pallid flesh, and brought the thirst up unbearably in his throat, driving him to the shelter of a cave. Blood would quench that awful growing thirst and drive out the cold that crept relentlessly over him, but it was hard to find blood. Other things would kill the cold, buds and growing things, but they could not quench the thirst or appease the savage hunger in him. There was another night at last, and he stood in the bright light of the shrinking moon high on a bare spur overlooking the valley. All the world lay before him, washed in silver and lined with black. He could see mountain after mountain, furred with the light of growing trees, blanketed in the glowing mist, their bald black crowns outlined against the moonlit clouds. He could see the mountain torrents streaking down their flanks like inky ribbons, joining, broadening, flowing down to join the river that roared sullenly under its black shroud in the valley at its feet. The valley was full of life. It was alive with growing things, and the white mist that rose from them and clothed them filled it in the brim with a broth of light through which the river and its tributaries cut sharp black lines of cold. There were other lights, yellow constellations of lamplight scattered over the silver meadows. Many of them clustered at the mouth of the valley, where the mountains drew apart, but they grew fewer and fewer as they followed the black barrier of the river, and at the head of the valley below him, one glowing spark burned alone. He stood with the moonlight washing his naked, dead white body, staring at that speck of golden light. There was something he should know about it, something that was hidden in that other world he had been in. There was something that drew him to it, as invisible thread, stretched across space through the white night, binding him to it. The next day he lay buried under a rotting log, halfway down the mountain. The following night, soon after moonrise, he came on a doe, its back broken, pinned under a fallen tree. He tore its throat out and drank the fuming blood that poured heat and life through his body, waking him, filling him with vigour. The cold was gone, and he was sure now that his fingers were glowing with a light of their own. Now he was really alive. He followed the ridge, and before sunrise he came to the river's edge. The blackness was an impenetrable wall, hiding the other shore. Through it he could hear the rush of running water over gravel, the gurgle of eddies and the mutter of rapids. The sound tormented him and brought the thirst back into his throat, but he drew back into the forest, for the sky was already brightening in the east. When the moon rose on the fourth night, he had found nothing to eat. Its light brought him down out of the forest again, to the river's edge, where it broadened into a quiet mill-pond. The black fog was thin over the glassy surface of the water, and through it he saw the yellow lamplight of the house that had drawn him down the mountain. He stood waist-deep in the weeds that bordered the pond, watching those two yellow rectangles. Back in the icy blankness of his mind, a memory was struggling to be known, but it belonged to the other world, the world he had left behind, and it faded. The reflection of the lights lay in the still water of the pond. So still was it that the mist was but a black gauze drawn across the lamplight, dulling it. The water lay like a sheet of black glass, hard and polished, with the phantoms of the pines on its other bank growing upside down in its quiet depths. The stars were reflected there in little winking spots, and the dwindling circle of the moon. He did not hear the door slam there among the pines. A new feeling was growing in him. It was strange. It was not thirst, not hunger. It submerged them in its all-powerful compulsion. It gripped his muscles and took them out of his control, forcing him step by step through the cattails to the river's edge. There was something he must do. Something. She came out of the shadows and stood in the moonlight on the other bank, looking up at the moon. The lamplight was behind her, and the silver torrent of the moon poured over her slim white body, over her shining black hair, caressing every line and curve of her long, slim figure. Her own light clung to her like a silver aura, soft and warm, welling out of her white skin and clinging lovingly about her, cloaking her beauty with light. That beauty drew him, out of the shadows, out of the forest, into the moonlight. She did not see him at first. The night was warm, and there was the first perfume of spring in the air. She stood on a rock at the water's edge, her arms lifted, her hands clasping her flood of night-black hair behind her head. All her young body was taut, stretching, welcoming the moonlight and the touch of the night breeze that sent little cat-paws shivering over the glassy water. The moon seemed to be floating in the water, there, just beyond her reach. She knotted her hair in a bun behind her head and stepped down quickly into the water. She stood with it just above her knees, watching the ripples widen and break the mirror surface of the pond. She followed their spread across that glassy disk. She saw him. He stood there, his face half in shadow, hunched and naked. His arms were skeleton's arms, and his ribs showed under skin that hung in flabby white folds from his shoulders. His eyes were black pits, and a stubble of black beard was smeared across his sagging cheeks. The mark of the owl's claws was across his face, and it was pocked with purple blotches where he had pulled out the porcupine quills. Some of them were still in his side, where the beast's tail had lashed him. His flesh was livid white in the moonlight, blotched and smeared with the dark stain of death. She saw him, and knew him. Her hand went to the little cross that glowed like a coal of hidden fire in the hollow of her throat. Her voice rose and choked back. "Joe! Joe!" He saw her and remembered her. The thread he had felt on the mountain had been her presence, pulling him to her, stronger than thirst or hunger, stronger than death, stronger even than the black fog over the river. It was between them now, tightening, dragging him step by step into the silent water. Ripples broke against his legs, and he felt the black mist rising from them, felt the numbness creeping into his feet, into his legs, up into his body. It was a day since he had killed the deer and had blood to warm him. He could not go on. He stood knee-deep, staring at her across the little space that separated them. He tried to speak, to call her name, but he had forgotten words. Then she screamed and ran, a stream of white fire through the shadows, and he heard the house door slam after her, and saw the shades come down, one after the other, over the yellow lamplight. He stood there staring after her, until the cold crept up and began to choke him, and he turned and stumbled painfully ashore. The moon found him high on the mountain, climbing from ledge to ledge, above the sources of the rushing torrents that walled him in, making his way towards the saddle that closed the valley's end. He could not cross running water, but he could go round it. He killed a rabbit, and its blood helped him to go on. with the cold seeping up through his bones, and hunger and thirst tearing at him like wild things. The new hunger, the yearning that drew him to the girl in the valley, was stronger than they. It was all that mattered now. The moon was still in the sky when he stood under the pines before the closed door of the house. Half the night was gone, and clouds were gathering, filling up the sky and strewing long streamers across the moon's shrunken face. In the east, thunder muttered, rolling among the mountains until it died away beneath the sound of the river. The tie that was between them was like a rope of iron, pulling him across the narrow clearing to the doorstep of the house. The door was closed and the shades drawn over the windows on either side of it, but yellow lamplight streamed out through cracks in its weathered panels. He raised a hand to touch it, and drew back, as he saw the patterns of crossed planks that barred him and his kind. He whimpered low in his throat, like the doe he had killed. The cross wove a steel net across the doorway that he could not break. He stepped back off the doorstep. The door was opened. She stood there. Her back was to the light, and he could see only the slim silhouette of her body, with the cross of golden fire at her throat, and the aura of silvery mist clinging about her, so warm and bright that he was sure it must drown out the moonlight. Even through the dress she wore, the fire of her young vitality shone out. He stood bathing in it, yearning for it, as the hunger and thirst and aching longing welled up in him through the bitter cold. It was a minute perhaps, or 5 minutes, or only seconds until she spoke. Her voice was faint. The pattern of the cross on the door could not bar him after her welcome. He felt the barrier dissolve as he stepped through. The clouds had drawn away, and the moon made a bright spot through the open door. He stood in it, watching her, seeing the familiar room with its scrubbed board floor, its plastered walls, its neat black stove, seeing them as if for the first time. They stirred no memory in him. But the girl drew him. He saw her dark eyes blacken with horror, and the blood drain out of her cheeks and lips as she saw him for the first time in the lamplight. He looked down at his hands. The flesh cheese-white and sloughing, at his naked discoloured body, smeared with mud and stained with spilled blood. He whimpered down in his throat and took a stumbling step toward her, but her hand went up to the little crucifix at her throat, and she slipped quickly around the table, placing it between them. He stared at the cross. The golden fire that burned in it separated them as surely as the cold black fog of running water had done. Across the table he could feel its pure radiance, hot as sunlight. It would shrivel him to a cinder. He whined again, in agony, like a whipped dog. The longing for her was sheer torment now, drowning out all else, but it could not force him nearer. The girl followed his gaze. The crucifix had been his gift, before, in that other world. She knew that, though he did not. Slowly she unfastened the ribbon that held it, and dropped it into his outstretched hand. The cross burned into his flesh like a hot coal. He snatched back his hand, but the burning metal clung. He felt the heat of it coursing up his arm, and hurled it savagely across the room. He seized the table with both hands and flung it out of his way. Then she was before him, her back against the wall, her face a mask of horror. He heard her scream. In him, the terrible yearning that had drawn him down from the mountain had submerged the hunger and thirst and cold that had been his only driving forces before he knew her. Now, as they stood face to face, the older, stronger forces surged up in him and took possession of his numbed mind. With her scream, a dam in him seemed to burst. He felt her warm, slim body twisting and jerking under his tightening fingers. He sensed the fragrance that rose from her. He saw her eyes, mad with fear, staring into his. At that moment the storm broke. The door was still open, and as he turned it seemed to be closed by a curtain of falling water. The black fog swirled among the raindrops, blotting out the world. He thrust out an exploring hand, marked with the charred brand of the cross, and snatched it back as he felt the chill of the mist. He heard voices only a moment before they stood there, 3 men, dripping, crowded together in the doorway, staring at the thing on the floor, and at him. For a flicker he remembered Louis, her brother, and Jean and old Paul. The dogs were with them, but they slunk back, whining, afraid. Louis knew him as his sister had, as the others did. His whisper had hate in it as much as fear. It was on all their faces. They knew the curse that was on the unshriven of Joe Labatty's blood. They had known what it all meant when he did not come down from the mountain on the night of the first storm. But only Louis, of them all, had seen the tree topple and pin him down. Louis it was who had made the mark of the cross in the snow that drifted over him and left him there. Louis Larue, who would not see the Labatty curse fall on his sister or her children after her. It was old Paul whose gun bellowed. They saw the buckshot tear through that death-white body, saw the dark fluid that dripped from the awful wound, saw the dead thing that was Joe Labatty, his skull's eyes burning as he surged toward them. They ran. Louis held his ground, but the thing that rushed upon him was like a charging bear. It struck him and hurled him to the floor. Its slippery fingers bit into his shoulders. Its hideous face hung close to his. But the crucifix at his throat saved him, as it might have saved her, and the thing recoiled and plunged out into the storm. The rain was like ice on his naked body as he fled, rinsing the strength out of him as it might dissolve salt. The black mist filled the forest, blotting out the silver light of its living things. It closed over his body and sank into it, sucking out the unnatural life he had drunk in blood, draining it of warmth. He felt the great cold growing in him again. The moon was gone, and he was blind, cold and numb and blind. He crashed into a tree, and then another, and then his weakening legs buckled under him and he fell face down at the river's edge. He lay in the running water, shrouded in the black fog, feeling them approach. He heard their footsteps on the gravel, and felt their hands on him, dragging him out of the water, turning him over. He saw them, 3 pillars of white light, the yellow fire of their crucifixes at their throats, the black mist billowing around their bodies as they stood staring down at him. He felt Louis's boot as it swung brutally into his side, and felt the bones snap and the flesh tear. But there was no pain, only the cold, the bitter, freezing cold that was always in him. He knew that they were busy at something, but the cold was creeping up into his brain behind his eyes as the rain wrapped him in its deadly mist. Perhaps when the moon rose again its light would revive him. Perhaps he would kill again and feel the hot blood in his throat and be free of the cold. He could barely see now, though his eyes were open and staring. He could see that old Paul had a long stake of wood in his hands, sharpened to a point. He saw Louis take it and raise it in both hands above his head. He saw Louis's teeth shine white in a savage grin. He saw the stake sweep down.